You mentioned October 7th. Do you think that the Israeli government knew about that beforehand and they just permitted to happen because of what was in their mind, that they can continue with that concept of Nakba that they've started in 1948? What was the end game in your opinion?
You can argue many theories. There are already what people call the conspiracy theories, and no, this was a plan of the Israelis, particularly the Netanyahu cabinet, in cooperation with the far right. And certainly it would fit with certain kind of apocalyptic tones of this government. And in the book, I argue that the ties of Prime Minister Netanyahu go way back with this kind of thinking. And he's not alone. There was a time, a period of time in the early spring when the Biden administration clearly was signaling that perhaps it would be easier to deal with somebody else representing the center-right or the conservatives, such as Benny Gantz. He also has his other foot very close to these far-right people. Same goes for Naftali Bennett and so on and so forth. So you can argue for these conspiracy theories. I'm not going to go there. There are a lot of characteristics to this offensive, but it certainly did not come out of the blue. It was a logical result of 50 years of failed military policies. It wasn't just a time bomb, it was about to explode, and now it has been exploding for a year. So what is the argument behind this? It is that right after this attack, October the 7th, it became very quickly known, and then the information increased within a week or two, that Israeli border soldiers had been signs of an impending attack for months, perhaps almost a year. Even CNN had a quite good piece about this a couple of weeks after the fact. And they had warned about this again and again and again, particularly in the weeks prior to the attack. They had seen even people preparing to use paragliders. They had seen people trying to use tunnels. They had seen people coming very close to the border walls. They had seen people rushing, driving bikes. I mean, what do you need? You don't have to be Marxist. You have to be Groucho Marxist in this case. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, perhaps it is a duck. So that Israel is far more vulnerable than people have thought. The fact that even now these bombs keep coming, as hard as Hamas has been hit, as hard as Hezbollah has been hit. And we know that there's a lot more still in the storage, both in the case of Hamas, especially with Hezbollah, and far more with Iran. So the question is not whether this makes sense. The question is how far the Netanyahu cabinet is willing to go before the US election, during the power transition in the US, and thereafter. Let me take a step back 50 years and then come to the present. I'll go back only very briefly. One argument that used to stand me in the early 70s and made me a supporter of the peace movement was that with fellow students at the time, I would say that why on earth wouldn't Israel not talk with Fatah? Why on earth wouldn't Israel not talk with Yasser Arafat? And the argument was always, oh, you cannot do that. He has dirty hands. He has blood in his hands. He's a terrorist. And then I would, of course, make the argument, knowing that it would hurt people even more, that one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. And what if you were a Palestinian? Would you not fight for your rights? Would you not start armed struggle if you felt that nothing else is really working here? And as terrible as it is, would you not start assassinations, my God? And those arguments were quickly buried. Then the idea that you cannot talk with a terrorist. And then they asked what I think about it. And I said, well, you can do that. But then next you will have to talk with PFLP, whose line at the time was a bit more radical. And then if you refuse to talk with Arafat and PFLP, you will have to talk with PDFLP. There will be a still more radical side. And if you refuse to talk with them, perhaps you would have to talk with Abu Nidal, who was the bad guy par excellence in 1980s. And that's how I think we ended with Hamas, the Israeli refusal to talk. Now, when Hamas comes along, the argument was again, oh, we can't talk peace with them. they engaged in suicide attacks. They did not, in the very beginning, to do that. They tried other means. And I haven't forgotten the fact that Hamas leaders, 1996, 1997, signaled willingness to talk peace. They signaled it, and they were pragmatic in that regard. Of course, they would negotiate for more. Why would they renounce their objective of destroying Israel until you talk in negotiations? Several ex-leaders of Mossad have made the same argument. Why would we ask Hamas to go so far when we didn't ask that even from Fatah? We didn't ask them to recognize us immediately. We wanted to talk. And let's not also forget the fact that when the peace process began, it did not begin with President Clinton there, Arafat here, Rabin and Peres here. No, it started in Oslo. It almost happened behind the back of the United States to a point, between the Israelis and Palestinians. Even with all the limitations of the two-state solution, there was that effort, at least in that direction. So what I'm trying to say here, that perhaps there has been this unwillingness to talk peace for a very long time. And in my book, in the last chapter, I argue that this may go back to 1948, 47. That was the first time when UN had its first. UN had just been created. A few months thereafter, they had their first intermediator, a Swedish count, Folke Bernadotte. And he suggested a lot of things, but he was also very concerned about the Palestinians. And his argument was that in war, all kinds of things may happen amid hostilities, but we should ensure that Palestinians who left their homes can come back and then build an enduring peace on that. A lot of Israelis at the time didn't like it, particularly those who represented the Stern group. They had him assassinated. One of the persons who ordered the hit, if you will, the assassination, was Yitzhak Shamir, who became the PM of Israel after Begin, and who was sort of a mentor and rival of Netanyahu prior to him. And Ben-Gurion's, the first PM of Israel, his bodyguard in the end of his life was Yehoshua Cohen, who was the assassin of Folke Bernadotte.